One of the biggest sources of public confusion about the Iran war is how the United States and its Middle Eastern allies have managed the escalating drone attacks. Anyone paying at least some attention to the war in Ukraine understands the magnitude of the long-range drone threat there. Every single day, Ukraine faces waves of dozens, sometimes hundreds of drone attacks. While most are intercepted and destroyed, some inevitably slip through to their intended targets, causing serious damage. Notably, many of these Russian drones are actually based on Iran-licensed technology, produced within Russia itself. This connection should make it clear that if conflict spreads in Iran, it's only logical to expect Iran's drones to start striking adversaries in the region. When these drones began hitting locations in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, both crucial US bases and assets of partner countries, public outrage surged. People asked, how can Ukraine, a nation with a pre-war GDP of just $200 billion, manage to shoot down expensive Russian drones at the cost of tens of thousands of the U.S. and its allies, while wealthier nations like the U.S.? The confusion reached a boiling point after Iran, or one of its proxies, targeted a British airbase in Cyprus, prompting Prime Minister Keir Starmer to announce plans to seek technical advice from Ukraine about drone defense systems. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky eagerly offered to help, a move that also reflected the political necessity of maintaining strong defense partnership. However, the prevailing impression of this narrative rests on two fundamental misconceptions. One misunderstanding concerns the nature of existing cooperation with Ukraine. The other relates to the broader U.S. strategy toward Iran, an approach that, in many ways, mirrors NATO's tactics for confronting Russia. Understanding these nuances is essential for grasping how the next major conflict might unfold. Let's begin by clarifying the current state of cooperation, which is comparatively straightforward. Loyal viewers of this channel will remember that the interchange of military technology and strategic lessons between NATO and Ukraine has evolved dramatically. Initially, NATO was the educator, imparting military doctrine to Ukraine. But by roughly the end of the first year of the war, battlefield realities had shifted enough that Ukraine was now providing valuable tactical insights back to NATO. What surprises me about the recent discussions, especially in the way Starmer has framed them, is the implication that Western countries have little to no understanding of how Ukraine successfully intercepts Shahd drones. That simply isn't true. In fact, there is a dedicated facility in Poland called the Joint Analysis, Training and Education Center, or JTEC for short, whose entire purpose is to ensure both sides are fully informed about each other's methods and tactics. Furthermore, while Ukraine indeed produces numerous one-way, Kiev imports a substantial number of drones from partner countries, ranging from standard quadcopters deployed on the front lines, except for the occasional crash when I'm flying them, to advanced interceptors specifically designed to counter Shaheeds. You might recall that last fall, I attended a NATO technology conference on the outskirts of Istanbul, where several interceptors from allied countries were showcased. These systems have since been tested on the battlefield in Ukraine. At the conference, experts were openly discussing the exact strategies that Starmer later described as being completely unknown. If you're curious about the detailed logistics of how Ukraine manages to shoot down Shahed drones, including the use of interceptors imported from various European countries, that information is available publicly. In fact, I created a comprehensive video explaining the entire process from initial detection to the final interception. Given all this, I find it puzzling what the current dialogue is truly about, or why it suggests that this conversation has just begun. Keith certainly isn't dispatching someone to the United States for the first time to teach the Pentagon how to defeat Shaheds. Those discussions have already occurred in Poland. I'm confident many Ukrainian specialists have already traveled across the Atlantic for focus talks. The same applies to British teams. They've been part of such exchanges in Poland as well. It's possible that some Arab countries might prefer direct training from Ukrainian forces, but that window for direct instruction was several years ago. By the time Arab militaries absorbed Ukraine's interception methods in full, the urgent need might have already diminished. Though, the most logical explanation is that Ukraine might be sending teams directly to these countries, complete with both air defense equipment and trained personnel. In return, Ukraine would likely receive heavier interceptors to replace what was lost. A kind of exchange they've been pushing for a very long time. This context aligns perfectly with the timing of these transfers. Conducting such operations prior to the onset of the Iran conflict wasn't practical since Ukrainian teams were fully engaged in the ongoing war. But now, with the Iran war underway, Zelensky's strategic options have been reshuffled. And it's clear he still holds cards to play, which he's now deploying. This is a stark contrast to conversations a year before the Iran conflict, when it seemed he had no cards left. However, a persistent question remains: will these interception teams reach their destinations in time to significantly affect the ongoing conflict? Adding to the confusion, there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the U.S. counter-drone strategy. Ukraine's standard approach involves shooting down Russian drones after they've crossed the border because no other viable alternatives exist for Kyiv. Of course, Ukraine's military also has its own suite of long-range attack methods, but intercepting drones once they're inside is the main practical strategy for countering these threats. Drones often steal the spotlight, especially the ones targeting refineries, those high-profile hits grabbing headlines. But beyond that, some drones aim for factories producing Russia's Shaheds. Ukraine's ability to strike these is pretty limited. Despite all the excitement around one-way attack drones, they just aren't powerful enough to reliably obliterate a well-fortified drone factory on their own. That's why Ukraine relies on a defensive or shield strategy. On the other hand, U.S. doctrine takes a different approach. The best defense is a strong offense. Instead of focusing on shooting down each drone or missile individually, the U.S. tries to eliminate the problem at its source, destroying warehouses, manufacturing sites, and launch platforms. The benefit here is clear: you don't have to keep casting a massive defensive net if you can nip the threat in the bud. This requires exceptional power projection capabilities. Fortunately, the U.S. excels in projecting power, which is why it's willing to take this risk. In the short term, their plan is to rely on high-quality interception systems to shoot down incoming attacks. This means most ballistic missiles get intercepted by Patriots and THAAD systems. When it comes to Shaheds, the bulk of the attacks, the plan involves Ukrainian teams assisting fighter jets patrolling the skies, shooting them down mid-air. Critics argue that this approach is unsustainable because each Iranian drone launch may cost just thousands of dollars, while intercepting them with air-to-air missiles or surface-to-air systems can cost hundreds of thousands or even millions. Meanwhile, Ukraine's own interceptors cost thousands per unit, which seems more cost-effective. There are 3 key points to consider here. First, Ukraine's interception system carries substantial startup costs before taking advantage of the low per-unit price. Second, When a coalition of wealthy countries handles the interception while a poorer country is launching attacks, you can effectively outspend the threat, even if it's not the most economically optimal solution. That's a matter of fine-tuning strategy rather than capability. Third, the current pristine interception systems are not meant to be a permanent fix. They're a temporary measure until the U.S. can dismantle Iranian systems at the source. This approach is sensible, especially given the cost difference and inventory limits. For example, there are only so many Patriot systems available, and ideally, you'd want your fighter jets focused on more valuable targets than just shooting down Shaheds. So, how's that working so far? By day 5 of the war, Iran's missile and drone launches had fallen by about 90% compared to the peak in the first 2 days. That's a strong indicator the drone and missile defense strategy is on track. And as I've hinted repeatedly, it raises an interesting question about whether a different, more offensive strategy might shift things further. Something worth keeping an eye on. The transfer of many assets from Ukraine is approaching a stage where their impact becomes visible and meaningful on the ground. That said, it's important not to jump to conclusions and declare the mission in Iran as fully accomplished just yet. The current situation is unfolding largely as expected. Here's a quick historical note to keep in mind should things take a turn for the worse. President Bush's famous mission accomplished speech was delivered on the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is now stationed just off the coast of Iran. If any misstep is noticeable so far, it lies in the underestimation of Iran's likely reaction to a combined U.S.-Israeli air campaign. Planners initially assumed Tehran would confine its attacks strictly to us or Israeli targets, probably to avoid escalating the conflict further. Instead, Iran escalated by launching strikes with munitions targeting almost everyone in the vicinity. Unfortunately, some allied countries were caught off guard and underprepared to defend against these onslaughts. This shortcoming will certainly be a major topic in any post-conflict analysis and raises important questions about why these nations have not committed to developing defensive systems similar to Ukraine's, especially considering Iran originally produced the Shahed drones involved. For now, the practical approach remains straightforward. Maintain constant vigilance for the duration of the conflict. At the same time, NATO allies are watching these developments closely. While debates continue over the direct and indirect roles each member state will undertake, it's the broader strategic implications that hold their attention. Currently, 2 main schools of thought try to explain the nature of the war in Ukraine. The first theory centers on modern military technology. Drones are inexpensive and relatively easy to manufacture in large numbers, enabling one side to saturate the skies. Sending valuable, state-of-the-art fighter jets to intercept these sheer numbers of inexpensive drones is deemed too risky. Consequently, the best countermeasure is to deploy one's own massive drone swarms. If Western forces want to win future conflicts, they need to embrace and expand their capacity to mass-produce drones. The second theory points to the limitations faced by Ukraine's military and Russia's political environment. Had Ukraine been equipped and trained with state-of-the-art weapon systems, it could more aggressively target and dismantle Russian industrial infrastructure, lessening the severity of the present drone-led struggles. On the other side, Russia's internal political situation restricts its ability to escalate the conflict through large-scale mobilization without provoking unrest among its population. Thus, the conflict grinds forward with slow territorial exchanges, including a particularly stagnant February. Some analyses even suggest Russia lost ground during this month, a rare piece of good news for Ukraine that may have slipped under the radar amid attention on the Iran situation. This pause in Russian advances likely coincided with Starlink communications becoming unavailable to Russia, proving to be a significant factor. Iran effectively serves as a testing ground for these competing theories. So far, with the United States rapidly gaining control airspace supremacy, the evidence seems to lean toward Ukraine's limited military reach as the primary factor restricting conflict dynamics, with three important caveats. First, it remains early in the conflict. Second, Iran doesn't possess the same level of sophisticated capabilities as Ukraine. And third, the evolving situation requires ongoing monitoring to better assess outcomes as events unfold. Let's break down why Russia remains heavily equipped compared to Iran, and what that means strategically. First, Russia spans vastly longer distances than Iran. This isn't a trivial detail. It profoundly shapes how conflicts play out. NATO's established doctrine focuses on gaining air superiority, systematically severing Russian supply routes, and effectively starving any remaining Russian forces both literally and figuratively. Without supplies, even the most dedicated Russian drone operators can't continue for long. The Allied forces have been hedging their bets, of course. This is reflected in the ongoing transfer of information at the Joint Theater Energy and the Allies' sustained investments in drone technologies. One particular investment deserves a deeper dive. It highlights why Arab nations have yet to develop drone defense capabilities comparable to Ukraine's. Glance at the regional map for a moment. The challenge is fundamentally a network problem. A Shahed drone might traverse multiple countries before reaching its intended target. Tackling this challenge requires networked solutions, precisely what Ukraine has implemented. Now, why is this relatively straightforward for Ukraine? Because Ukraine is a single country with various regions capable of seamless communication. So, when a Shahed drone flies across multiple Ukrainian regions en route to a target, Ukraine's internal network can handle it effectively. Contrast this with Iran's Shaheds, which often cross several countries to hit a target. Technically, a regional network could coordinate defenses against such threats, but in reality, these countries lack a robust history of cooperation that would make such a network feasible. If we consider Europe as an example, solving this network issue might be more manageable, given their stronger ties. NATO is actively crafting a blueprint for a regional defense shield through a program called LCAT. We've mentioned this project before. It is among the more visible initiatives at NATO's Allied Command Transformation Headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia. And just to clarify to local listeners, I won't be pronouncing Norfolk the local way. After all, this is a family show about warfare. On the topic of automation and coordination, one key aspect recently showcased was automated target prioritization, highlighted during the Allied Command Transformation Hackathon in Rachio that I attended last week. Those were the simpler days when a single war was the main focus. One subtle but crucial challenge during these events is managing the overwhelming mass of incoming threats. Automation really helps sort and prioritize targets effectively. Not surprisingly, it was the Ukrainian team that took first place in this competition segment. On the other end of the operational spectrum, the real challenge lies in enabling 32 different systems to interoperate seamlessly. This is why NATO dedicates so much time and effort to joint exercises. It's less about perfecting skills and more about making effective collaboration across nations possible in the first place. This brings us to a pressing issue within the Middle East: interoperability. What interoperability does not look like is Kuwait accidentally shooting down 3 US F-15s, an unfortunate example of a catastrophic failure in coordination. Therefore, any true region-wide solution will be both complex and costly. While tackling these challenges on a country-by-country basis may be somewhat easier, it still demands significant investment and effort to set up and maintain these systems. You can understand why some might choose to stick with the costly option, at least for now. But depending on how Iran shapes up after the war, there could be a strong case for beginning to develop a layered defense strategy. And looking ahead to the next month or two, they might end up wishing they had started earlier. If you found today's video interesting, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next episode.